you were a chick, who's the one guy you would sleep with?
John Stamos.
What? Did we just become best friends?
Yup.
Do you want to go do karate in the garage?
Yup.
Yep, indeed. Welcome back, everyone, to Between Bells.
Despite managing only a 55% on Rotten Tomatoes, Will Ferrell's Step Brothers remains one of the most quotable movies in pop culture 11 years after its release. And now the rating site is releasing its first book, Rotten Movies We Love, dedicated to films like Step Brothers that may have been misunderstood at first, but found their audience later on. Joining us now is Joel Mears, editor-in-chief at Rotten Tomatoes. Joel, we love the concept of this book. This is amazing. But Will Ferrell, John C. Reilly, they're on the cover. Will Ferrell seems to be the king of bad movies we love to hate and hate to love. Was that kind of the thinking behind this cover?
Well, the thinking was that rotten doesn't always necessarily equate to bad, I think is the case. So when you look at what rotten means on our side is that the movie wasn't necessarily critically well received at the time of its release. And that's the case of Step Brothers, but movies have an afterlife. They live on beyond that initial release and people grow to love them. And Step Brothers is a huge case in point. You guys said it was the most quotable. We loved it. We were like, we're going to slap that on the cover because people will buy it, but also because people just love those guys.
Well, it's totally. I mean, when we were going through the list of some of the films in this, it's kind of incredible because some of the movies in this book are genuinely beloved by so many people. For instance, Steven Spielberg's Hook was destroyed by critics, but it has a 26% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Such a good film.
I didn't think anybody knew that. Do you think the goal in this for readers are to go through this and find their favorite movies and be surprised at what the rating is? Because then that shows that they're much different in terms of their spectrum of what they think of movies compared to everybody else?
I think the part of the delight of the book is that you go in and you see movies like Hook, you see movies like The First Wives Club, you see movies like Empire Records, and you're like, I did not at all expect those two films to be rotten, and there's surprise and delight there. But there is, you know, the book has sections. So there's books about, there's sections about movies that became popular like those films. There's sections about cult classics, and there is a section about movies that are so rotten they're good as well, which are always fun to watch.
Probably fun to discuss what to even put on the list too, right? How were the conversations? Was there a lot of arguing? How'd you come up with those lists?
Just fights. We were splatting each other with tomatoes. No. So we have the technology to go press a button and get every rotten movie in our database into a nice, unmanageable spreadsheet, which was really the starting point. And then we went through them as a staff and said, okay, which films have had an interesting life and which films have an interesting story? Because if you look at something like Hook, again, something that was slammed when it came out, was overblown, Spielberg's sort of worst film at the time, but it's come to be beloved. And we really wanted to tap into those movies that had inspired debate and discussion and burrowed their ways into our hearts for a different manner of reasons. And then we invited 16 critics from all over the world to just go and choose their own movies. So we've got like Leonard Moulton, we've got guys in Australia, you know, prominent new-coming critics as well, who are talking about films they love, and we just we gave them carte blanche.
The bad movies that we love often have some kind of personal connection, right? I loved Hook because it was always playing in my uncle's house.
Rufio.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love Showgirls because I always wanted to be a dancer.
There's some kind of personal connection for you. Was there a particularly bad movie that you were like, you know what? This is my jam, has to be in this book.
Well, we were saying burlesque earlier. I think
yes, true.
That awoken certain feelings in me at a certain time in my life. But I will say Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, which is it's in the 30s, I believe. I saw it as one of the first films I saw in the cinema with my uncle, who would go on to pass away. And it was just a beautiful experience. I loved the original. I felt the second one really doubled down. It sort of set me on a path to wanting to move to New York one day.
Wow.
And I think we all have those personal connections, especially with films we see as youngins. And then sometimes we go back and watch them and I'm like, oh, that's an interesting choice. The pigeon lady, the cameo in that one. But yeah, so I think we all have those personal
One of the other things I find fascinating, if you look at the aggregate of all the movies on Rotten Tomatoes, the average score is a 64%. It's basically technically certified fresh, but I mean, it's not spectacularly high. Do you view that more as an indictment on us as critics or the movie industry, that it's a 64%?
Ooh, that is an interesting question. One quick correction there. 75% is certified fresh and 60% is fresh.
Oh,
That's why
thank you.
So, but I think what that is, you know, people say that critics often go in with a certain attitude, or we have this view of like the critic as the guy from Ratatouille who goes in and has a certain sort of snootiness. They're not there to enjoy films, but then you look at these actual scores and you see that overall critics go in and they actually come out and give them a pass because they're just fans. This is what we find. We're not necessarily the critics, but we relate to critics, obviously, and we aggregate their scores. And those that we meet, they go into cinemas and they are as excited to see a film and as optimistic about that film succeeding as the general public. So I think that score is maybe surprising to some people because they may associate us with the rotten end end of the spectrum.
Right.
And this book's going to probably help in that perception.
Yes.
But I think, critics sometimes think get a bum deal.
In doing research for this book, did you gather any themes as to why something becomes a cult film later on, or it keeps, like Rocky Horror Picture Show, for
Or Big
example?
Lebowski.
Right, it just becomes this cult following. Why does that happen to some films?
I think it's what you were saying earlier about that personal connection, but I think a lot of the cult sort of classics that we feature in this film are from the 90s. And I think there's something about the technology of VHS. I think there's something about the blockbuster effect of going down those aisles and seeing films that you kind of relate to, because you're all living in disparate suburbs in different parts of the world. And what is it that connects you to this one thing? You see something you like, you identify with that film. There's something in that film that speaks to you. And oftentimes the cult classics speak to the marginal sort of groups of society, so LGBT, before it was mainstream Comic-Con culture, the big sort of superhero movies, they appealed. And people could find a sort of sense of identity. And then in these events that they go to, like Rocky Horror, live that out in real life.
Right.
Well, and to that point, though, can the scores change after, let's just say, after a certain period of time? Let's just say the movie creates a cult following, does terrible at the box office with critics, but then it becomes beloved later. Can the scores change later?
Absolutely. So the Rotten Tomatoes scores, the Tomato Meter scores are all dynamic. So reviews can be added as long as they're approved at any time. So you can go back and re-review things. And the scores do change. And that was one of the fears of the book, actually, because once you print it in like March last year, and you've got things that are in the 50s and on the cusp, I'm like, oh gosh, what happens if somebody
all
goes
these
and
new
changes it?
entrants now.
There
New
was one
fresh
film that
films.
we were considering called Deep Blue Sea, which is
I love Deep Blue
wonderful
Sea,
film. I
yes.
love Deep Blue Sea. 59% on the Tomato Meter. I'm like, do we put it in or is it too risky? And just last week it ticked over because
my
some
gosh.
genius went in and wrote a
Yes.
fabulous
I
review.
love
Was
it.
that you that wrote the fabulous
I'm
review
not
to
allowed
put
to
it in
write
there?
reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. It's all about the critics,
Well,
not
Joel,
me.
we're so excited to rewatch some of these bad
Yes.
movies, and thanks for stopping by. This is Joel Mears, editor-in-chief of Rotten Tomatoes.
Thanks for having me, guys.